The champagne cork popped with a satisfying sound as I poured myself a glass of Dom Pérignon. My husband David thought I was celebrating his promotion to senior partner at the law firm. What I was actually celebrating was the fact that in exactly 6 hours, his entire world would come crashing down. You see, David believed I was the perfect submissive wife who spent her days arranging flowers and hosting dinner parties. He had no idea that for the past 8 months I'd been meticulously documenting his affair with his paralegal Jessica, his embezzlement from client trust funds, and his plan to divorce me while hiding our assets offshore. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony wasn't lost on me as I sat in our marble kitchen, surrounded by the luxury that David's illegal activities had purchased, while he showered upstairs, humming cheerfully and completely oblivious to what awaited him. My name is Catherine Wells, though most people in our affluent Denver suburb knew me simply as David's wife, the quiet woman who smiled politely at charity galas and never spoke unless spoken to. That carefully crafted image had served me well these past months, allowing me to move through David's world like a ghost, invisible and underestimated. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. 3 years ago, I had been exactly what David wanted me to be. Fresh out of graduate school with a degree in forensic accounting that I'd never used, I'd married the charming attorney who promised me a life of comfort and security. I traded my career ambitions for designer dresses and became the perfect accessory to David's meteoric rise in Denver's legal circles. I hosted his colleagues, smiled at his jokes, and played the role of the devoted wife who was content to live in her husband's shadow. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday in February when I decided to surprise David with lunch at his office. I'd spent the morning at the farmer's market buying ingredients for his favorite sandwich and thought it would be romantic to show up unexpectedly. The receptionist was at lunch, so I made my way to David's corner office, balancing the carefully wrapped meal and a thermos of homemade soup. The door was slightly ajar, and I heard voices inside. Not wanting to interrupt if he was with a client, I paused in the hallway. That's when I heard Jessica's breathy whisper, telling David how much she'd enjoyed their weekend in Aspen, followed by David's low chuckle as he described the condo he was planning to buy her in Miami. My blood turned to ice as I listened to them discuss our upcoming anniversary party, with Jessica complaining about having to watch David pretend to be the loving husband while she stood in the background like hired help. David's response shattered whatever remained of my naive trust in our marriage. He told Jessica that I was too stupid to ever figure out what was happening right under my nose, that I was like a well-trained pet who would never bite the hand that fed her. He described me as mentally weak and utterly dependent on him, someone who would never have the courage or intelligence to leave even if I discovered his infidelity. The casual cruelty in his voice as he dismissed me as a non-threat was more devastating than learning about the affair itself. I stood frozen in that hallway, clutching the lunch I'd prepared with such care, listening to the man I'd devoted 3 years of my life to describe me as if I were a simple-minded child. But beneath the humiliation and heartbreak, something else began to kindle. It wasn't the hot flash of anger I might have expected, but something colder and more calculating. David had made a critical error in judgment. He'd underestimated me so completely that he'd revealed not just his affair but his fundamental contempt for my intelligence. I backed away from his office door silently, my mind already beginning to work. In the elevator, descending to the parking garage, I made a decision that would define the next 8 months of my life. I wasn't going to confront David in a tearful scene that would give him time to cover his tracks and control the narrative. Instead, I was going to use his arrogance and dismissiveness against him. If David thought I was too stupid to be a threat, then I would be the most dangerous kind of opponent, the one he never saw coming. The first stop was my old professor from graduate school, Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, who'd always encouraged me to pursue forensic accounting, despite David's subtle discouragement of my career ambitions. Elizabeth had built a successful consulting firm specializing in financial fraud investigations, and when I called her that afternoon, she immediately sensed something was wrong. Over coffee at a quiet cafe far from David's usual haunts, I explained my situation without going into specifics about my marriage. Elizabeth's eyes lit up with the kind of predatory gleam I remembered from her most challenging lectures. She offered me a consulting position with her firm, ostensibly as a part-time researcher working from home on white-collar crime cases. It would give me access to investigative resources and legal expertise while providing the perfect cover story for David. As far as he knew, I'd taken up a harmless hobby doing research for Elizabeth's academic papers. He actually praised me for finding something productive to do with my time, never suspecting that I was learning the exact skills I'd need to unravel his crimes. My education in David's deceptions began with his phone. Modern smartphones, I discovered, are remarkably careless about protecting their owners' secrets when those owners believe they have nothing to hide. David never bothered to change the passcode I'd seen him use dozens of times, never thought to delete his messages or clear his browser history. Why would he? His stupid wife would never think to look, and even if she did, she'd never understand what she was seeing. Through David's phone, I gained access to a world I'd never suspected existed. Text messages with Jessica revealed the depth of their relationship, which had been going on for over a year. But more disturbing were the financial communications I discovered. David had been systematically skimming money from his clients' trust accounts, using his position as their attorney to access funds that should have been untouchable. The amounts were staggering. Nearly $2 million moved through a complex network of shell companies and offshore accounts. Each discovery led to more questions, and Elizabeth's training had given me the tools to find answers. I learned to trace digital footprints, to understand the financial instruments David was using to hide his stolen money, and to document everything in a way that would be admissible in court. My days fell into a routine that David never questioned. I'd wake up early to prepare his breakfast and see him off to work, then spend my morning researching his activities. Afternoons were devoted to what David saw as my social obligations, charity work, and lunch dates with other attorneys, wives, interactions that I began to see as intelligence-gathering opportunities. The wives knew things their husbands didn't realize they'd shared. Over mimosas and salad, I learned about office dynamics, about which clients were unhappy with their legal representation, about rumors of financial irregularities at David's firm. I became a student of gossip, parsing casual comments for useful information while maintaining my reputation as a harmless social butterfly who was more interested in party planning than business affairs. As spring turned to summer, my investigation expanded beyond David's immediate crimes. I discovered that his affair with Jessica was just the latest in a series of relationships with young women who worked at the firm. There had been at least 3 others over the past 2 years, each relationship following the same pattern. David would pursue them aggressively, showering them with expensive gifts and promises of a future together, then abandon them when they became too demanding, or when someone newer caught his attention. Jessica, I realized, was already being phased out. David's phone revealed flirtations with a new associate named Amanda, and his travel patterns suggested he was setting up another romantic getaway that wouldn't include Jessica. The cruelty was breathtaking, not just toward me but toward all the women he manipulated and discarded. It reinforced my growing conviction that David wasn't just an unfaithful husband, but a predator who used his position and charm to exploit anyone he perceived as vulnerable. The financial picture became clearer as my skills improved, and Elizabeth's resources gave me access to databases and investigation tools I couldn't have accessed on my own. David's theft wasn't opportunistic but systematic, targeting elderly clients and those going through family crises, who were less likely to scrutinize their accounts carefully. He'd developed a sophisticated system for moving money through legitimate-looking transactions, always taking amounts small enough to avoid triggering automatic fraud detection systems. By midsummer, I had compiled enough evidence to destroy David both professionally and personally, but I wasn't ready to act yet.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Elizabeth had taught me that the key to a successful investigation was patience, allowing the subject to reveal the full scope of their crimes before moving to shut them down. David's arrogance was making him increasingly careless, and I sensed that bigger revelations were coming. My intuition proved correct in August when I discovered David's most ambitious scheme yet. He was planning to leave not just me, but the country entirely. Using his legal expertise and stolen funds, he'd been establishing a new identity in the Cayman Islands, complete with a residence, bank accounts, and a fabricated professional history. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would fake his own death in a sailing accident during our planned anniversary trip to the Caribbean, collect on a massive life insurance policy he'd recently purchased, and start over with his new identity and stolen millions. The insurance policy was the final piece of evidence I needed. David had taken out a $5 million policy on his life just 6 months earlier, naming me as the beneficiary while secretly planning to claim the money himself after faking his death. It was fraud on multiple levels, and it confirmed what I'd begun to suspect about David's ultimate plans for me. I wasn't meant to survive our anniversary trip. A grieving widow lost at sea alongside her husband would be a tragic but tidy end to any loose ends. As September arrived and our anniversary trip approached, I finalized my own preparations. Elizabeth had helped me understand not just how to document David's crimes, but how to ensure that justice would be served in a way that couldn't be appealed or overturned. The evidence I'd gathered was overwhelming, but it needed to be presented at exactly the right moment and in exactly the right way. I'd also made personal preparations that David knew nothing about. The submissive wife he thought he'd married had quietly opened her own bank accounts, established a credit history, and secured her own legal representation. I'd even started seeing a therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in helping women recover from manipulative relationships. Sarah had helped me understand that David's treatment of me wasn't just neglect or selfishness, but a deliberate pattern of emotional abuse designed to keep me dependent and compliant. The final weeks before our anniversary required the performance of my lifetime. I had to act excited about our trip while knowing it was planned as my murder, had to smile at David's colleagues while documenting their potential complicity in his crimes, and had to maintain the facade of loving devotion while every fiber of my being recoiled from his touch. The hardest part wasn't hiding my knowledge of his betrayals, but hiding the person I'd become over these 8 months of investigation. I was no longer the naive woman who'd married David 3 years earlier, or even the heartbroken wife who'd discovered his affair in February. I'd become someone harder and more calculating, someone capable of long-term strategic thinking and patient execution of complex plans. David's cruelest insult had been to call me mentally weak, but his manipulation had actually forged me into someone far stronger than either of us had imagined possible. 3 days before our anniversary trip, I sat in our kitchen with my glass of champagne, watching David prepare for what he believed would be his final performance as my devoted husband. He'd been unusually affectionate lately, probably experiencing some guilt about his planned murder of the woman he'd once promised to love and protect. Or perhaps he was just practicing his role as the loving husband whose tragic death would soon make headlines. I thought about Jessica, probably packing for what she believed would be a romantic reunion with David in Miami after his supposed death. I thought about Amanda, the new associate who had no idea she was being set up as David's next victim. I thought about David's elderly clients, trusting him with their life savings while he systematically stole from them. And I thought about myself, the supposedly stupid wife who had spent 8 months building an unbreachable case against the man who'd underestimated her so catastrophically. Tomorrow would bring the culmination of everything I'd worked toward. David thought he was about to execute the perfect crime, disappearing with millions of stolen dollars while leaving behind a conveniently dead wife. Instead, he was about to discover that the woman he'd dismissed as harmless had become the architect of his complete destruction. The champagne tasted like victory, though David would never understand why I was really celebrating. As I finished my drink and prepared to play the loving wife one final time, I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. David had been right about one thing during that conversation I'd overheard in his office. I would never have had the courage to leave him if I'd simply discovered his affair. But his mistake had been revealing not just his infidelity, but his fundamental contempt for my intelligence and worth as a person. That contempt had awakened something in me that David could never have anticipated, and tomorrow he would finally understand the price of underestimating Catherine Wells. The morning of our anniversary dawned gray and drizzling, fitting weather for what David believed would be our final day together. I prepared his favorite breakfast of eggs Benedict, and freshly squeezed orange juice, watching him read the financial news on his tablet with the satisfied expression of a man who thought he'd outsmarted everyone around him. He complimented the hollandaise sauce and kissed my cheek before heading to the office for what he called last-minute trip preparations. In reality, I knew he was making final transfers to his offshore accounts and confirming arrangements with his contact in Grand Cayman. What David didn't know was that I'd been in touch with his contact for 3 weeks. Marcus Brennan, the man facilitating David's new identity, had a weakness for gambling that had left him deeply in debt to some very unforgiving people. Elizabeth's connections in the financial investigation world had led me to Detective Ray Santos of the Denver Police Department's white-collar crime unit, who'd been building a case against Brennan for months. When Santos approached Brennan with evidence of his illegal identity creation business, the panicked criminal had been eager to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges. Brennan had been feeding David false information while recording every conversation and documenting every transaction. The boat David planned to sabotage was equipped with GPS tracking devices. The insurance investigator David thought he'd bribed was actually an undercover federal agent. Most importantly, the death certificate and cremation arrangements David had paid for were completely fictional, designed to draw him deeper into a web of evidence that would be impossible to escape. I spent the morning at my final therapy session with Dr. Chen, who'd become more than just my counselor over these past months. Sarah had helped me understand that my desire for justice wasn't about revenge, but about protecting future victims and reclaiming my own power. She'd also helped me prepare for the emotional aftermath of what was about to unfold. Destroying someone who'd once meant everything to you, even someone who'd planned to murder you, would inevitably leave psychological scars that would need careful tending. During our session, Sarah asked me the question I'd been dreading. Was I certain I could live with the consequences of my actions? David's downfall wouldn't be quick or clean. He would face federal charges for embezzlement, insurance fraud, and attempted murder. The stolen money would be traced and returned to his victims, but the damage to his reputation and career would be permanent. His family, including his elderly parents who'd always been kind to me, would have to face the reality of what their son had become. I thought about Margaret and Robert Wells, David's parents, who lived in a quiet retirement community in Arizona, and sent us anniversary cards every year with handwritten notes about how proud they were of their successful son and his lovely wife. They would learn about David's crimes through news reports, watching their family name become synonymous with betrayal and theft. The guilt I felt about their pain was genuine and sharp, but it wasn't enough to change my course. David had made his choices, and consequences didn't stop being justified just because they affected innocent people. The hardest part of my preparation hadn't been gathering evidence or coordinating with law enforcement. It had been coming to terms with my own transformation. The woman sitting in Sarah's office bore little resemblance to the naive graduate student who'd fallen for David's charm 3 years earlier. I'd developed skills in deception and manipulation that would have appalled my younger self. I could lie convincingly while looking someone directly in the eye, compartmentalize my emotions to function normally while planning someone's destruction, and think strategically about human psychology in ways that felt almost predatory. Sarah helped me understand that these weren't necessarily negative changes. The ability to recognize and counter manipulation was a form of protection I'd needed long before I'd developed it. The strategic thinking that seemed so cold and calculating was actually a healthy response to having been systematically undermined and controlled. What mattered wasn't whether I'd changed, but whether I could integrate these new capabilities into a version of myself that I could respect and live with. After therapy, I drove to my final meeting with Detective Santos at a coffee shop near the courthouse. Ray was a weathered man in his 50s who'd spent 20 years investigating financial crimes, and he'd seen enough cases like David's to know exactly how they typically ended. Most white-collar criminals, he told me, believed their intelligence and social status would protect them from serious consequences. They hired expensive attorneys, negotiated plea deals, and served minimal sentences in minimum security facilities before returning to some version of their previous lives. That wouldn't be happening in David's case. The evidence I'd gathered, combined with Santos's investigation and Brennan's cooperation, had created what prosecutors called a bulletproof case. David would face multiple federal charges with mandatory minimum sentences that would keep him in prison for decades. The insurance fraud alone carried a 20-year sentence, and the attempted murder charges would likely add life imprisonment. Even if David's attorneys managed to negotiate some kind of plea agreement, he would never again be free to manipulate and harm vulnerable people. Santos handed me a small electronic device that looked like a car key fob, but was actually a panic button connected directly to FBI surveillance teams. If anything went wrong during our trip, if David suspected what was happening or became violent, I could summon immediate help. He also gave me a nearly invisible earpiece that would allow me to communicate with the team monitoring our activities. The technology felt surreal, like something from a spy movie rather than my real life, but it provided crucial peace of mind. The afternoon was devoted to final preparations that David would witness without understanding their true significance. I packed our luggage for the trip, including the designer clothes David had bought me for what he believed would be my final public appearances. I confirmed our dinner reservations at the exclusive restaurant where David planned to propose a romantic toast to our future together, never imagining that federal agents would be recording every word from nearby tables. I even called his parents to wish them well and assure them we'd send photos from our romantic getaway. That last conversation with Margaret Wells nearly broke my composure. David's mother was genuinely excited about our trip, telling me how wonderful it was to see her son so happy and devoted to his marriage. She mentioned how proud she was of the man David had become, and how grateful she felt that he'd found such a loving wife. Her warmth and sincerity made me feel like the cruelest person alive, knowing that within days she would learn the truth about both her son and the woman she'd welcomed into their family. As evening approached, I found myself in the strange position of getting dressed for dinner with a man who planned to murder me while I planned to destroy him. The irony wasn't lost on me that we were both preparing for elaborate performances, each believing we were about to outwit the other. I chose a simple black dress that David had always complimented, applied makeup with hands that remained remarkably steady, and rehearsed my lines for the final act of our marriage. David arrived home in an expansive mood, bringing champagne and roses like a lover, rather than a potential murderer. His performance was flawless, full of tender gestures and romantic declarations that would have fooled anyone who didn't know what lay beneath his charming exterior. He told me how much he loved me, how excited he was about our future together, and how this trip would mark the beginning of the best years of our lives. Every word was a lie, but his delivery was so convincing that I could almost understand how he'd managed to deceive so many people for so long. Dinner at Le Bernardin was a masterpiece of dramatic irony. David had reserved a corner table with a view of the city lights, the same spot where he'd proposed 3 years earlier. He ordered our most expensive bottle of wine and made a series of toasts that seemed heartfelt and romantic to anyone listening. The federal agents at nearby tables, their presence invisible to David, recorded every moment of his performance, while I played my part as the adoring wife who had no idea of the danger she faced. During the main course, David presented me with what he called an early anniversary gift. It was a stunning diamond necklace that I recognized from his credit card statements as costing nearly $50,000. Money stolen from his clients had paid for the jewelry he was giving to the wife he planned to murder, adding another layer of obscenity to an already grotesque situation. I accepted the necklace with apparent delight, allowing him to fasten it around my neck while fighting the urge to recoil from his touch. The most chilling moment came when David raised his glass for a final toast. He spoke about how marriage was about trust, about how rare it was to find someone you could be completely honest with, someone who would never judge or betray you. He talked about the importance of loyalty and commitment, about how lucky we were to have found true love in a world full of deception and selfishness. The audacity was breathtaking, but what made it truly disturbing was that David seemed genuinely moved by his own words. Some part of him appeared to believe the romantic fantasy he was creating, even as he planned my death. After dinner, we returned home for what David believed would be our final night together. He was tender and attentive, making love to me with a passion that seemed genuine despite everything I knew about his intentions. Lying beside him afterward, listening to him sleep peacefully while planning my murder, I felt a profound sense of disconnection from the person I'd once been. The woman who'd married David would have been destroyed by this betrayal, but the woman I'd become felt only a cold satisfaction that justice was finally within reach. I didn't sleep that night, instead lying still and reviewing every detail of what would unfold over the next few days. Our flight to Miami would depart at noon, followed by a connecting flight to Grand Cayman. David had chartered a sailing yacht for what he'd described as a romantic sunset cruise, but which was actually the stage for my planned murder. The boat would suffer a mysterious explosion that would kill me while allowing David to escape with minor injuries that would support his story of being a lucky survivor of a tragic accident. Federal agents would be monitoring every step of our journey, but they wouldn't intervene until David made his move. The plan required me to be in genuine danger in order to add attempted murder charges to his list of crimes. I would be wearing a tracking device and carrying emergency communication equipment. But there would still be moments when my life would hang in the balance while David tried to kill me. The thought should have terrified me, but instead I felt only a strange calm, as if the scared and vulnerable woman David had married had been replaced by someone harder and more resilient. As dawn approached, I quietly rose and made my way to the kitchen for one final review of the evidence I'd compiled. 8 months of investigation had produced thousands of pages of documentation, hundreds of recorded conversations, and financial records that painted a complete picture of David's crimes. Elizabeth had helped me organize everything into a presentation that would be delivered to prosecutors immediately after David's arrest, ensuring that even his expensive legal team wouldn't be able to find loopholes or procedural errors to exploit. The victims of David's theft would finally get justice, and more importantly, they would recover their stolen money. The shell companies and offshore accounts David thought were untraceable had been mapped and frozen by federal investigators. Every dollar he'd stolen would be returned, along with interest and penalties that would come from David's own legitimate assets. The elderly clients he'd targeted would learn that their trust hadn't been misplaced after all, that there were still people willing to fight for what was right. David stirred awake as I was making coffee, stretching and smiling with the contentment of a man who believed he'd successfully orchestrated the perfect crime. He complimented the sunrise streaming through our kitchen windows and talked about how much he was looking forward to our romantic getaway. His performance was so convincing that I almost wondered if he'd somehow convinced himself that he really was taking his beloved wife on an anniversary trip rather than planning her murder. Over breakfast, David reviewed our itinerary one final time, ostensibly to ensure I knew what to expect, but actually to reinforce the cover story he'd prepared. He emphasized how isolated and peaceful our sailing destination would be, how we'd be completely alone together, with nothing but ocean and sky for company. The romantic imagery he painted was actually a description of the perfect place to commit murder without witnesses, but he delivered it with such apparent sincerity that anyone listening would have heard only a devoted husband planning a special celebration. As we finished our meal and prepared to leave for the airport, David pulled me close and kissed me with what seemed like genuine emotion. He told me he loved me more than life itself, that these past 3 years had been the happiest of his existence, and that he couldn't wait to spend the rest of his life showing me how much I meant to him. The words were beautiful and heartfelt, and they would have meant everything to me if they'd been true. Standing in his arms, feeling the warmth of his body and the familiar scent of his cologne, I allowed myself one moment of grief for what we'd lost. There had been genuine love between us once, before David's greed and cruelty had poisoned everything we'd built together. The man I'd fallen in love with might have been largely an illusion, but my feelings for him had been real. That woman was gone now, transformed by betrayal into someone capable of elaborate deception and calculated revenge. But she deserved a moment of acknowledgement before disappearing forever. Then David stepped back and smiled his charming smile, and the spell was broken. This wasn't the man I'd loved, if that man had ever truly existed. This was a criminal and a predator who saw other people as obstacles to be eliminated or resources to be exploited. The wife he claimed to adore was just another victim in his carefully planned scheme, disposable once she'd served her purpose. He'd forfeited any claim to my sympathy or mercy the moment he'd decided I was too stupid to live. As we loaded our luggage into David's Mercedes for the drive to the airport, I felt the weight of the panic button in my purse and the nearly invisible earpiece in my ear. Federal agents were already in position at the airport and in Miami, ready to document David's every move as he walked deeper into the trap I'd spent 8 months preparing. Everything was ready. The only question now was whether David would actually go through with attempted murder when the moment arrived, or if his courage would fail him at the last second. I hoped, for his sake as much as mine, that he would find some spark of conscience and abandon his plans. But I knew David too well to believe that was likely. He'd spent months preparing for my death, investing time and money into elaborate arrangements that couldn't be easily abandoned. More importantly, he'd convinced himself that I deserved to die, that my supposed stupidity and worthlessness justified murder. Men like David didn't suddenly develop empathy when it became inconvenient. As we drove toward the airport through Denver's morning traffic, David reached over and took my hand, intertwining our fingers like young lovers heading off on their honeymoon. To anyone watching, we looked like a successful couple embarking on a romantic anniversary celebration. The reality was far darker, but that would become clear soon enough. David thought he was taking his clueless wife to her death, but he was actually walking into the most sophisticated trap I'd ever laid. By tomorrow night, one of us would be facing the rest of our life behind bars, and it wouldn't be me. The Miami airport buzzed with the usual chaos of international travelers, but I moved through it in a bubble of hyper-aware calm. David handled our luggage and boarding passes with the efficiency of someone who'd made this journey many times before, though officially this was our first visit to the Caribbean together. He pointed out landmarks through the terminal windows and made cheerful observations about the weather, maintaining his performance as the excited husband treating his wife to a dream vacation. What David didn't notice was the subtle choreography happening around us. The businessman reading a newspaper near our gate was Agent Martinez from the FBI's Miami field office. The young couple arguing softly about their connecting flight were federal marshals who would be on our plane to Grand Cayman. The maintenance worker servicing planes on the tarmac was photographing every aircraft David looked at, documenting his interest in escape routes he believed were still secret. Our connecting flight was smaller, a regional aircraft that would take us to the island where David had spent months preparing his new life. As we settled into our first-class seats, David ordered champagne and made a toast to adventure and new beginnings. The irony was so thick I could barely swallow the expensive wine, but I smiled and clinked my glass against his while federal agents in coach seats recorded our every word through sophisticated listening devices. During the flight, David became increasingly animated, pointing out islands below us and sharing what he claimed were random facts about Caribbean geography. In reality, he was rehearsing the cover story he'd prepared, establishing familiarity with the region that would support his eventual claim of being a lucky survivor rather than a murder conspirator. He described the sailing conditions we could expect, the isolation of the waters where we'd be cruising, and the unpredictable weather patterns that could turn dangerous without warning. The Grand Cayman airport was smaller and more relaxed than Miami, with the kind of laid-back tropical atmosphere that made it popular with tourists seeking to escape their everyday lives. David had chosen his destination well. This was a place where wealthy Americans came to disappear, whether legally through financial privacy or illegally through false identities and hidden crimes. The local authorities were accustomed to not asking too many questions about visitors who paid in cash and kept to themselves. Our hotel was a luxury resort that catered to the kind of guests who valued discretion above all else. David had booked the honeymoon suite under his real name, but I knew he'd also made reservations elsewhere under the false identity he planned to assume after my death. The suite was beautiful, with panoramic ocean views and a private balcony where David suggested we might have dinner before our sailing excursion the next day. His romantic planning was meticulous, right down to the murder he intended to commit. That evening, as we dressed for dinner at the resort's most exclusive restaurant, David seemed to slip deeper into his role as the devoted husband. He helped me with my jewelry, complimented my dress with apparent sincerity, and gazed at me with what looked like genuine adoration. The performance was so convincing that I found myself wondering if some part of him had managed to forget what he was really planning. Perhaps the cognitive dissonance of maintaining such an elaborate lie required him to believe it temporarily. Dinner was a perfect recreation of our early courtship, complete with intimate conversation and lingering touches that would have melted my heart 3 years earlier. David ordered my favorite wine without asking, remembered details about my preferences that I'd forgotten mentioning, and shared memories of our relationship that seemed genuinely cherished. If I hadn't known about his plans for the next day, I might have believed we were simply a couple rekindling their romance in paradise. The most disturbing moment came when David excused himself to take what he claimed was a work call. Through the listening devices I was wearing, Agent Martinez and his team could hear David's conversation with Marcus Brennan, the facilitator who was helping orchestrate my murder while secretly working with federal investigators. David confirmed the timing for our sailing trip, reviewed the signal system they'd established for the boat's destruction, and verified that his new identity documents would be ready for pickup immediately after my death. What chilled me most wasn't the practical details of the murder plot, but the casual tone David used when discussing my death. He referred to me as the problem that needed to be resolved before he could move forward with his new life. There was no emotion in his voice, no apparent conflict about ending the life of someone he'd claimed to love. I was simply an obstacle to be eliminated, no different from any other business problem that required a practical solution. When David returned to our table, he was all smiles and romantic attention, as if he hadn't just been discussing the best way to kill me. He took my hand and spoke about how much this trip meant to him, how grateful he was that we could share such perfect moments together. The contrast between his public persona and his private reality was so stark that I felt like I was having dinner with a complete stranger who happened to look like my husband. After dinner, we walked along the beach under a canopy of stars that would have been breathtakingly beautiful under different circumstances. David pointed out constellations and shared stories about sailing under these same skies, building the narrative expertise he'd need to explain his survival of tomorrow's planned accident. He seemed relaxed and happy, like a man looking forward to a pleasant day on the water rather than someone preparing to commit murder. Back in our suite, David made love to me with a tenderness that felt almost like goodbye, though he couldn't have known how accurate that impression was. This would indeed be our last night together, but not in the way he imagined. By tomorrow evening, one of us would be in federal custody, while the other began the long process of rebuilding a shattered life. As I lay beside him in the darkness, listening to his peaceful breathing, I marveled at his ability to compartmentalize such extreme contradictions. The next morning brought perfect sailing weather, with gentle breezes and clear skies that David proclaimed ideal for our romantic cruise. He'd arranged for breakfast on our balcony, complete with fresh tropical fruit and the kind of elaborate presentation that resort staff reserved for their most generous guests. David's tips had been lavish throughout our stay, establishing him as a memorable guest whose tragic story would be widely discussed after my supposed accidental death. As we prepared for our day on the water, David became increasingly solicitous about my comfort and safety. He insisted I wear a life jacket at all times, claiming concern for my limited swimming abilities. He packed extra sunscreen and water bottles, ostensibly worried about dehydration and heat exposure. He even suggested I take motion sickness medication, despite my having no history of seasickness. Every precaution was designed to support his eventual claim that he'd done everything possible to protect his beloved wife from an unforeseeable tragedy. The marina where David had chartered our yacht was a collection of pristine white boats bobbing in crystal-clear water that reflected the Caribbean sun like scattered diamonds. Our vessel was a sleek sailing yacht named Serendipity, a name that David had probably found amusing when he'd selected it for the site of my murder. The captain who would take us out was a weathered local named Emmanuel, who'd been sailing these waters for 30 years and had an impeccable reputation for safety and discretion. What Emmanuel didn't know was that his boat had been thoroughly inspected by federal agents and fitted with tracking devices that would monitor our exact location throughout the trip. The explosive device David planned to detonate had been replaced with a harmless pyrotechnic that would create smoke and noise without actually damaging the vessel. Most importantly, the Coast Guard cutters positioned just beyond the horizon were ready to intervene the moment David made his move. As we boarded Serendipity, David chatted easily with Emmanuel about sailing conditions and local navigation hazards, demonstrating a familiarity with the area that supposedly came from extensive research rather than multiple previous visits. He asked detailed questions about emergency procedures and communication protocols, information he claimed to want for safety reasons, but actually needed to ensure his survival when the boat appeared to explode. The early part of our cruise was genuinely pleasant, with gentle winds carrying us along the coastline while dolphins played in our wake and seabirds wheeled overhead. David pointed out landmarks and shared what he claimed were newly learned facts about the island's history, building his cover story while seemingly just making conversation. Emmanuel proved to be an engaging guide, sharing stories about famous guests he'd sailed with and local legends about pirates and treasure hunters. For a few hours, I could almost forget the sinister purpose of our excursion and simply enjoy the beauty of sailing in paradise. The water was the most extraordinary shade of turquoise I'd ever seen, clear enough that we could watch tropical fish swimming beneath our hull. The sun was warm but not oppressive, tempered by the ocean breeze and the yacht's elegant canopy. Under different circumstances, this could have been the perfect anniversary celebration David had pretended to plan. But as we sailed further from shore, approaching the isolated coordinates David had selected for my murder, the atmosphere began to change. David became more attentive to our exact position, checking his watch frequently and scanning the horizon as if looking for something specific. He struck up a conversation with Emmanuel about the boat's safety systems, asking questions about emergency beacons and life raft deployment that seemed casual, but were actually reconnaissance for his planned escape. Around midday, Emmanuel anchored us in a secluded cove that David claimed he'd read about in travel guides, but had actually scouted during previous visits. The location was perfect for what David had planned, isolated enough that any explosion would go unwitnessed, but close enough to shore that a strong swimmer could survive the journey. Emmanuel prepared lunch while David and I sat in the cockpit, apparently enjoying the peaceful surroundings while he waited for the right moment to strike. The signal came in the form of a text message that David claimed was from his office, but was actually from Marcus Brennan confirming that everything was ready. David's demeanor shifted subtly, becoming more focused and purposeful, while maintaining his facade of relaxed enjoyment. He suggested that Emmanuel might enjoy exploring the reef with snorkeling gear, a suggestion that would conveniently remove the captain from the boat when the explosion occurred. As Emmanuel prepared his snorkeling equipment, I felt the weight of the panic button in my swimsuit pocket and the reassuring presence of the nearly invisible tracking device Agent Martinez had given me. Federal agents were monitoring our location and communications from multiple positions, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. But for the plan to succeed, I needed to allow David to actually attempt murder before they could act. The most surreal part of the entire experience was maintaining normal conversation while waiting for my husband to try to kill me. David pointed out colorful fish in the water and made jokes about my pale skin needing more sunscreen, playing the caring husband right up until the moment he planned to end my life. I responded with appropriate laughter and affection, matching his performance while every nerve in my body screamed with tension. When Emmanuel slipped into the water with his snorkeling gear, David's mask finally began to slip. His smile became forced, his movements more deliberate. He checked his watch again and scanned the horizon one final time before reaching into the bag where he'd hidden the device he believed would destroy the boat and kill me. This was the moment 8 months of planning had led to, the culmination of everything I'd discovered about the man I'd married. David turned to me with what might have passed for a loving expression if I hadn't known what was coming. He spoke about how much he loved me, how perfect this moment was, how he wanted to remember this feeling forever. Then his hand closed around the detonator, and I saw something cold and final enter his eyes. The charming husband disappeared entirely, replaced by someone I'd never seen before, but had always suspected existed beneath the surface. Time seemed to slow as David raised the device, his finger poised over the trigger that he believed would end my life and begin his new existence as a wealthy widower. The irony was exquisite. He thought he was about to commit the perfect crime, but he was actually providing the final piece of evidence that would destroy him completely. Every word he'd spoken, every action he'd taken, every calculation he'd made, had been recorded by federal agents who were about to demonstrate just how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. In that suspended moment before David pressed the button, I allowed myself one last look at the man I'd once loved enough to marry. Somewhere beneath the greed and cruelty, perhaps there had once been someone worthy of that love. But that person was gone now, consumed by an appetite for wealth and power that had turned him into a monster, capable of murdering an innocent woman whose only crime had been trusting him. David's finger pressed down on the detonator, and the world erupted in smoke and sound as the harmless pyrotechnic device created the illusion of a catastrophic explosion. Through the artificial chaos, I could hear the roar of approaching Coast Guard boats and the distinctive whine of federal helicopters closing in on our position. David's perfect crime had just become his perfect downfall, and the stupid wife he'd dismissed as harmless had finally revealed herself as the architect of his destruction. The artificial smoke cleared to reveal David's face frozen in complete bewilderment. The massive explosion he'd expected had produced nothing more than theatrical effects and the acrid smell of burnt chemicals. Around us, the yacht remained perfectly intact while the sound of approaching engines grew louder with each passing second. David's confusion transformed into panic as he realized that something had gone catastrophically wrong with his carefully orchestrated murder. Agent Martinez was the first to board our vessel, his tactical team moving with practiced efficiency as they secured the scene. David's survival instincts kicked in, and he immediately began performing the role of confused victim, demanding to know what was happening and why armed federal agents were surrounding a peaceful sailing excursion. His acting skills were impressive, but they were wasted on an audience that had been monitoring his every move for months. Emmanuel surfaced from his snorkeling expedition to find his charter boat transformed into a crime scene, with David in handcuffs and me being checked by a Coast Guard medic, despite having no injuries. The poor captain's confusion was genuine and profound, as Agent Martinez explained that he'd unknowingly participated in a failed murder plot. Emmanuel's shock was so complete that he could barely form coherent sentences, alternating between English and rapid Spanish, as he tried to process what had happened on his boat. David's protests grew more desperate as the reality of his situation became undeniable. He demanded to speak with his attorney, claimed diplomatic immunity that didn't exist, and insisted that everything was a misunderstanding that could be easily resolved. When those tactics failed, he tried a different approach, suggesting that I had orchestrated everything as an elaborate frame-up motivated by jealousy over his success. The irony of that accusation was breathtaking, considering how accurately it described his own character. Agent Martinez read David his rights with the kind of professional detachment that comes from years of arresting white-collar criminals who believe their education and social status should protect them from consequences. David's face cycled through disbelief, rage, and finally a calculating coldness as he began to understand that his perfect crime had become his perfect downfall. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of hatred and grudging recognition that he'd underestimated his opponent completely. The Coast Guard cutter that transported us back to Grand Cayman felt like a floating courtroom where David's fate was being sealed with every mile we traveled toward shore. Federal prosecutors had already been notified of his arrest, and extradition proceedings were being expedited to bring him back to Denver, where the bulk of his crimes had been committed. The web of evidence I'd spent 8 months weaving was about to be presented to a federal grand jury that would almost certainly return multiple indictments. During the journey back to port, I found myself studying David's profile as he sat in restraints, staring out at the ocean where he'd planned to watch me die. There was something almost tragic about his complete inability to understand how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. He kept glancing at me with expressions that suggested he was trying to reconcile the submissive wife he thought he knew with the woman who had orchestrated his downfall with such methodical precision. Agent Martinez briefed me on what would happen next as Grand Cayman's coastline grew larger on the horizon. David would be held in local custody while extradition paperwork was processed, a procedure that typically took 72 hours but could be expedited, given the severity of the charges. Federal prosecutors in Denver were already preparing arrest warrants for Jessica and potentially other accomplices who had helped David embezzle client funds or plan his fake death. The media attention would be intense, Martinez warned me. David's arrest for attempted murder and embezzlement would make national headlines, especially given his prominence in Denver's legal community and the elaborate nature of his crimes. I would need to be prepared for reporters camping outside my home, for old friends and acquaintances reaching out with questions and offers of support, and for the inevitable attempts by David's defense team to portray me as a vindictive wife who had manipulated the situation. What Martinez couldn't have predicted was how ready I felt for that scrutiny. 8 months of investigation had prepared me not just to expose David's crimes, but to defend my actions against anyone who questioned them. I had documentation for every decision I'd made, legal justification for every step I'd taken, and most importantly, a clear conscience about having protected future victims from a dangerous predator. The Grand Cayman port was buzzing with activity as news of David's arrest began to spread through the island's tight-knit community. Local law enforcement officials who had been briefed on the operation watched with professional interest as federal agents transferred their prisoner from Coast Guard custody to the island's detention facility. David's transformation from respected tourist to international criminal had happened so quickly that some resort staff were still processing the news. I was escorted to a secure location where I would remain until commercial flights could return me safely to Denver. The FBI had arranged for protective surveillance, not because David posed any immediate physical threat, but because his arrest would trigger a complex investigation that might expose other criminals who had less to lose than a disgraced attorney. The offshore banking networks David had used were connected to money laundering operations that involved people far more dangerous than a suburban lawyer. While David began his first night in a Caribbean jail cell, I sat in a hotel conference room reviewing the timeline of events with Agent Martinez and his team. Every aspect of David's plan had been documented and recorded, creating an evidentiary record that would be nearly impossible for even the most skilled defense attorney to challenge. The attempted murder charge alone carried a potential life sentence, but the financial crimes added layers of federal penalties that would ensure David never again had the opportunity to harm innocent people. The most satisfying revelation came when Martinez showed me the complete scope of their investigation into David's offshore accounts. The $2 million he'd stolen from clients was just the beginning. Federal forensic accountants had traced connections to international fraud networks worth over $50 million, with David serving as a key facilitator for criminals who used his legal expertise to legitimize their operations. His arrest would provide prosecutors with leverage to pursue cases they'd been building for years. Jessica's role in David's crimes was more extensive than I'd initially realized. She hadn't been just his affair partner and unwitting accomplice, but an active participant in the embezzlement scheme, who had used her paralegal position to identify vulnerable clients and facilitate unauthorized transfers. Her arrest warrant had already been signed, and federal agents in Denver were moving to secure her before she could flee or destroy evidence. The ripple effects of David's downfall would extend throughout Denver's legal community, where his embezzlement had involved trust accounts managed by his law firm. Partners who had trusted David with firm finances were about to discover that their professional reputations and personal assets were at risk. The Colorado Bar Association was already preparing disciplinary proceedings that would result in disbarment for anyone who had participated in or enabled David's crimes. Most importantly for his victims, the complex offshore structures David had created to hide stolen money were being dismantled by federal investigators who specialized in recovering assets from international fraud schemes. Every dollar David had taken would be returned with interest, and additional damages would be paid from David's legitimate assets, including our home, his retirement accounts, and even his life insurance policies that he'd planned to collect fraudulently. As the evening progressed and the reality of David's situation became undeniable, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought us to this point. The naive woman who had discovered her husband's affair 8 months earlier could never have imagined herself capable of orchestrating such an elaborate counterattack. But David's cruelty and arrogance had forged me into someone harder and more strategic, someone capable of long-term planning and patient execution of complex revenge. The psychological transformation hadn't been without cost. I'd developed skills in deception and manipulation that would have appalled my younger self, learned to compartmentalize emotions that interfered with strategic thinking, and discovered reserves of ruthlessness I'd never known existed. These weren't necessarily negative changes, but they represented a fundamental alteration in my character that would affect every relationship and decision for the rest of my life. Dr. Chen had helped me understand that David's betrayal hadn't just damaged our marriage, but had forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about my own capacity for both victimization and retaliation. The woman who had spent 3 years accommodating David's increasingly controlling behavior had needed to develop new skills to survive his ultimate betrayal. The question now was whether I could integrate those skills into a version of myself that I could respect and live with. Agent Martinez interrupted my introspection with news that David had requested to speak with me privately, claiming he had information about other crimes that he would only reveal in exchange for a face-to-face meeting. The request was obviously a manipulation tactic, probably an attempt to gauge my emotional state or plant seeds of doubt about my actions. Martinez recommended against the meeting, but ultimately the decision was mine to make. I agreed to see David, partly out of curiosity about what he might say, and partly out of a desire to look him in the eye one final time as the husband I'd once loved and the criminal he'd revealed himself to be. The meeting would be monitored and recorded, with federal agents present to ensure my safety and prevent any attempts at intimidation or manipulation. David would remain in restraints throughout the conversation, reducing him from the powerful attorney he'd once been to just another prisoner making desperate bargains. The detention facility where David was being held was a modern building designed to house white-collar criminals and other high-profile prisoners, who posed minimal physical risk but maximum flight risk. David's cell was comfortable but basic, a far cry from the luxury hotel suite we'd shared just hours earlier. The contrast seemed to symbolize the complete reversal of fortune that had transformed him from predator to prisoner in the span of a single afternoon. When I entered the interview room, David looked smaller somehow, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and ankle restraints that marked his new status. But his eyes still held the calculating intelligence that had made him such a successful attorney and such a dangerous criminal. He studied my face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a complex puzzle, searching for clues about how thoroughly his world had collapsed. David's opening words were exactly what I'd expected from someone who had spent his career manipulating juries and intimidating opponents. He claimed to still love me despite everything that had happened, insisted that his affair with Jessica had been a meaningless distraction that he'd been planning to end, and suggested that we could work together to minimize the damage to both our futures. The performance was skilled but hollow, undermined by the recording devices that had captured him discussing my murder with casual indifference. When charm and manipulation failed to achieve their intended effect, David shifted tactics and revealed the coldness that had always lurked beneath his surface charisma. He accused me of destroying an innocent man's life out of petty jealousy, claimed that his financial crimes had been victimless technicalities blown out of proportion by overzealous prosecutors, and suggested that my evidence had been obtained through illegal surveillance that would be thrown out of court. The most telling moment came when David realized that none of his familiar tactics were working on me anymore. The submissive wife who had once accommodated his every demand and accepted his explanations without question had been replaced by someone who could see through his manipulations with perfect clarity. His frustration was palpable as he struggled to find leverage over someone who had already accepted the complete destruction of their relationship. David's final gambit was to appeal to whatever remained of the love I'd once felt for him, painting a picture of the life we could still have together if I cooperated with his defense team and testified about my supposed mental instability during our marriage. He promised that his attorneys would portray me sympathetically as a victim of his neglect, who had suffered a psychological breakdown that led to elaborate fantasies about murder plots and financial crimes. I listened to his desperate proposals with the detached interest of someone observing a fascinating but ultimately irrelevant performance. The man sitting across from me in shackles bore little resemblance to the person I'd fallen in love with 3 years earlier, if that person had ever truly existed. David had revealed himself to be exactly what he'd always been beneath the surface charm, a predator whose only regret was getting caught before he could complete his latest crime. When I finally spoke, my words were measured and final. I told David that I hoped he would find some measure of peace during his incarceration, that I forgave him for the pain he'd caused me personally, but that I would never apologize for protecting his victims and preventing future crimes. His sentence would be determined by judges and juries, but his moral judgment had already been rendered by his own actions. As I prepared to leave the interview room for the final time, David made one last desperate attempt to regain control over the situation. He threatened to reveal embarrassing details about our private life, to claim that I had been complicit in his financial crimes, and to paint me as an unstable woman whose testimony couldn't be trusted. The threats were empty and pathetic, the final gasps of a drowning man who still couldn't accept that his victim had become his executioner. Walking away from that detention facility, I felt a profound sense of closure that had nothing to do with revenge, and everything to do with justice finally being served. David would spend decades in federal prison, his victims would recover their stolen money, and future potential victims would be protected from his predatory behavior. The woman who had been dismissed as too stupid to threaten him had orchestrated his complete and irreversible downfall, 6 months later, I stood in the courthouse hallway watching David's defense attorney emerge from another failed plea negotiation. Michael Richardson was one of Denver's most expensive criminal lawyers, retained by David's family using what remained of their savings after federal asset seizures. Richardson's expression told me everything I needed to know about how the negotiations had progressed. Federal prosecutors weren't interested in deals when they had overwhelming evidence and multiple felony charges that would keep David imprisoned for the rest of his natural life. The media circus surrounding David's trial had exceeded even Agent Martinez's predictions. Cable news networks covered every development in what they'd dubbed the perfect murder plot, while legal analysts dissected the evidence I'd gathered with the kind of fascination usually reserved for landmark cases that would be studied in law schools for decades. David's photograph appeared on magazine covers alongside headlines about betrayal, greed, and the dangerous arrogance of successful men who believed themselves above consequences. I'd testified before the federal grand jury 3 months earlier, walking them through 8 months of meticulous investigation that had exposed not just David's crimes against me, but an international network of financial fraud that had stolen over $50 million from victims across the country. My testimony lasted 4 days, during which prosecutors presented evidence that painted a complete picture of David's transformation from respected attorney to international criminal. The grand jury's decision to indict David on 37 separate federal charges had surprised even the prosecutors who'd built the case. The evidence I'd gathered had given them leverage to flip other conspirators, including Marcus Brennan and 2 offshore banking specialists who'd helped David establish his false identity. Each new cooperating witness had revealed additional crimes, creating an avalanche of charges that made any possibility of acquittal mathematically impossible. Jessica's trial had concluded the previous month with her conviction on 18 felony counts and a sentence of 12 years in federal prison. Her testimony against David had been devastating, confirming details about the embezzlement scheme and revealing his attempts to recruit her as an accomplice in my murder. The illusion that she'd been an innocent victim of David's manipulation had crumbled under cross-examination that exposed her active participation in targeting vulnerable clients. Standing in that courthouse hallway, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that February day when I'd overheard David's casual dismissal of my intelligence and worth. The woman who had discovered her husband's betrayal through accidental eavesdropping had evolved into someone capable of bringing down an international fraud network while ensuring justice for dozens of victims who might never have recovered their stolen money. The personal cost of that transformation had been significant. Friends and family members struggled to reconcile the quiet, accommodating woman they remembered with the determined investigator who'd orchestrated such an elaborate takedown. Some admired my strength and strategic thinking, while others seemed uncomfortable with the calculated patience I'd displayed while gathering evidence. The old Catherine would have prioritized everyone else's comfort over her own sense of justice. Dr. Chen had helped me understand that their discomfort reflected their own fears about what they might be capable of under similar circumstances. My actions had forced people to confront uncomfortable questions about the lengths they would go to protect themselves from someone who planned to murder them. The fact that I'd used legal methods and worked with federal investigators didn't diminish the unsettling reality that I'd spent months deceiving someone I'd once loved. The financial settlement had exceeded all expectations. Federal asset recovery specialists had traced and seized every dollar David had stolen, plus additional funds from his legitimate investments and insurance policies. After restitution to his victims and payment of legal fees, I'd received a settlement that would ensure financial independence for the rest of my life. More importantly, David's other victims had recovered their life savings with interest, allowing elderly clients to maintain their dignity and security. My relationship with David's parents had been the most difficult casualty of the entire situation. Margaret and Robert Wells had initially refused to believe that their son was capable of such crimes, insisting that I'd manipulated evidence to frame an innocent man out of spite over his affair. The overwhelming evidence presented at trial had eventually convinced them of David's guilt, but they blamed me for destroying their family, rather than acknowledging that David had made his own choices. Their pain was genuine and heartbreaking, but I couldn't accept responsibility for consequences that David had brought upon himself and his family. Margaret's tearful accusation that I could have simply divorced David quietly without destroying his career ignored the reality that he'd been planning to murder me. Their son wasn't the victim of a vindictive ex-wife, but a criminal who'd escalated from financial fraud to attempted murder when his other schemes became unsustainable. The media attention had brought unexpected opportunities alongside unwanted scrutiny. Elizabeth's consulting firm had received dozens of inquiries from attorneys representing clients who suspected financial fraud, leading to new cases that would help other victims recover stolen assets. My role in David's investigation had established me as an expert in financial crimes, opening career possibilities I'd never considered during my years as David's wife. Speaking engagements at law enforcement conferences had become a regular part of my new life, sharing insights about how financial predators operated and how their victims could protect themselves. The audiences were usually composed of detectives, prosecutors, and federal agents who appreciated the methodical approach I'd taken to documenting David's crimes. My background in forensic accounting, combined with my firsthand experience as a victim, provided a unique perspective that helped investigators understand the psychology of both criminals and their targets. The most rewarding aspect of my new career was working directly with victims of financial fraud, helping them navigate the complex process of recovering stolen assets and rebuilding their lives. Many were elderly clients who'd trusted attorneys, financial advisors, or investment managers who'd systematically stolen their savings over periods of years. Their gratitude for my assistance was deeply meaningful, providing purpose that went far beyond personal satisfaction or financial compensation. One particular case had involved a widow named Helen Martinez, whose estate attorney had stolen nearly $400,000 from her husband's life insurance settlement. Helen's situation reminded me of my own vulnerability during the early years of my marriage with David, when I'd trusted someone completely without understanding the warning signs of financial manipulation. Working with Helen to recover her stolen money had felt like protecting the person I used to be. The psychological recovery had been more challenging than the financial or professional adjustments. Dr. Chen had warned me that the skills I'd developed to survive David's betrayal might be difficult to integrate into healthy future relationships. Learning to trust again after discovering that someone I'd loved was planning to murder me required careful attention to my own emotional responses and reactions to potential partners. Dating had been complicated by my notoriety in Denver's legal and business communities, where most eligible men knew exactly who I was and what I'd done to my previous husband. Some were intimidated by my reputation for methodical investigation and strategic thinking, while others seemed attracted to those same qualities for reasons that felt uncomfortable. Finding someone who could appreciate my strength without being threatened by it, or fetishizing it, required patience and careful evaluation. The man I'd been seeing for the past 2 months, Dr. James Chen, a professor of criminology at the University of Colorado, had approached our relationship with the kind of intellectual curiosity that felt respectful rather than exploitive. He'd studied my case in his graduate seminars on white-collar crime, but his interest in me as a person had developed independently of my professional reputation. Our conversations about criminal psychology and victim advocacy had evolved naturally into personal connection. James understood the transformation I'd undergone without romanticizing it, or expecting me to apologize for the choices I'd made to protect myself and other victims. His own research into financial fraud had given him appreciation for the complexity of cases like David's, where personal betrayal intersected with systematic criminal behavior that affected dozens of innocent people. He valued my insights without treating me as a trophy or a cautionary tale. The anniversary of David's arrest had passed quietly, marked only by a brief news segment updating viewers on his unsuccessful appeals and failed attempts to negotiate reduced sentences. Federal prosecutors had offered him a plea deal that would have resulted in a 30-year sentence instead of life imprisonment, but David's ego and his family's delusions about his innocence had prevented him from accepting responsibility for his crimes. His current attorney, a public defender named Sarah Kim, who'd inherited the case after Richardson withdrew when David's family could no longer afford his fees, had advised David that his chances of successful appeal were essentially non-existent. The evidence against him was too overwhelming, the documentation too thorough, and the testimony from cooperating witnesses too damaging to overcome through legal technicalities or procedural challenges. David's life in federal prison had been difficult, according to reports from correctional officers who'd testified at his various hearings. White-collar criminals often struggled to adapt to the realities of incarceration, especially those who'd held positions of power and respect in their previous lives. David's legal knowledge made him valuable to other inmates seeking help with their appeals, but it also made him a target for those who resented his education and former privileges. The most satisfying development had been the recovery of funds for David's elderly victims, several of whom had attended his sentencing hearing to deliver victim impact statements that brought tears to hardened federal marshals. Mrs. Eleanor Rodriguez, an 83-year-old widow whose retirement savings David had stolen, told the court that recovering her money had allowed her to remain in her own home rather than moving to a nursing facility she couldn't afford. Another victim, Robert Kim, a Korean War veteran whose disability settlement David had embezzled, used his recovered funds to pay for medical treatments that had been delayed while he struggled with the financial impact of David's theft. The real-world consequences of David's crimes became undeniable when victims testified about the stress, anxiety, and practical hardships they'd endured, while their life savings seemed to have vanished forever. The federal judge who'd sentenced David to life imprisonment without possibility of parole had been particularly moved by the testimony of Thomas Anderson, a retired teacher whose pension fund David had raided to finance his luxury lifestyle. Anderson's statement about the sleepless nights and constant worry he'd experienced while trying to figure out how to survive on Social Security alone had reduced several jurors to tears and clearly influenced the judge's decision to impose the maximum sentence allowed under federal guidelines. My own victim impact statement had focused not on the personal betrayal I'd experienced, but on the systematic nature of David's crimes and the premeditated cruelty of his plan to murder me, rather than simply divorcing me and dividing our assets. I'd explained to the court that David's attempt on my life wasn't a crime of passion or desperation, but the calculated decision of someone who viewed other people as obstacles to be eliminated when they became inconvenient. The judge's response to my testimony had been particularly pointed, noting that David's attempt to murder his wife while stealing from elderly and vulnerable clients demonstrated a level of moral bankruptcy that posed a continuing danger to society. The court found that David had forfeited any claim to mercy through his systematic exploitation of trust relationships and his escalation from financial fraud to attempted murder when other schemes became unsustainable. Standing in the courthouse 6 months later, watching Richardson's frustrated exit from another failed negotiation, I felt a profound sense of closure that had been building gradually since David's conviction. Justice had been served not just for me, but for all his victims. The money had been recovered and returned. The criminal network he'd participated in had been dismantled. Most importantly, David would never again have the opportunity to manipulate, steal from, or harm innocent people. The woman who discovered her husband's betrayal through accidental eavesdropping had evolved into someone capable of protecting herself and others through legal channels that ensured lasting consequences for dangerous criminals. The skills I developed during 8 months of investigation had become the foundation for a career that provided meaning and purpose while helping other victims navigate their own paths to recovery and justice. As I walked out of the courthouse and into the Denver sunshine, I thought about the conversation I'd overheard in David's office that had started this entire journey. His dismissive comment about my intelligence and his certainty that I would never pose a threat to his plans had revealed not just his criminal intentions, but his fundamental contempt for the woman he'd claimed to love. That contempt had awakened something in me that David could never have anticipated and could never have defeated. The stupid wife he'd underestimated had become the architect of his complete downfall, using every advantage his arrogance had provided to build an unbreachable case that would keep him imprisoned for the rest of his natural life. David had been right about one thing during that conversation I'd overheard. I would never have had the courage to simply leave him if I'd only discovered his affair. But his mistake had been revealing not just his infidelity, but his plan to murder me, and his complete dismissal of my worth as a human being. That revelation had transformed me into someone stronger, smarter, and more determined than either of us had imagined possible. The price of that transformation had been the loss of my innocence and trust, but the reward had been justice for myself and dozens of other victims who might never have recovered from David's crimes. As I drove home to my new life, I carried the satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, the underestimated can become the most dangerous opponents of all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.